Berkeley Executive Education released an article where they described the importance of clear and direct communication. Their findings revealed that clarity and precision reduces ambiguity and ensures your team members have a concrete understanding of what their tasks and their goals are. Clear communication helped avoid misunderstandings that can eventually lead to costly errors or delays. The article also stresses direct communication, which is the ability to promote inclusivity. This helps avoid divisive language, and instead it promotes a more transparent dialogue where, the people in charge, the leaders, they can create a more supportive environment for the team. Language that is more precise leaves a little bit less room for interpretation, and in particular, it's actually very valuable in fast-paced environments where when you are as direct and you are as precise in explaining what you want, you're going to get those results a lot faster than maybe being a little bit more nuanced. A separate publication called Effective Communication Strategies also reinforces the power of direct communication. In this publication, direct communication encourages quicker and more effective decision-making processes. Essentially, when everybody is understanding their role and what their responsibilities are, the team themselves can make faster decisions, and they don't really need to wait for anybody to give them guidance. Instead, they can solve their own problems efficiently, and at the end of the result, that is an overall increase in productivity for the operation because you don't have that lag where you have to re-explain things to somebody. And for the leaders who do use more direct communication, they're viewed by their subordinates, by the employees, as being somebody who is more assertive but also more competent. So instead of having a leader that isn't able to communicate correctly and maybe losing control and they start making indecisive decisions and they don't have that direct communication, these types of leaders are able to take control of the situation and bring out better results, essentially. So let's dive into the importance of direct communication. Think about a time where you've been communicating with somebody and at the end you end up more confused than when you started. Or maybe you sent an email at work and you think, oh man, I completely butchered this. I should have sent this instead of that, or I wasn't as precise, or maybe I didn't answer, or I used they, that, them, this, or you weren't using specific language. At the end of the day, communication is one of the most critical skills that we need to have in our personal and our professional setting. Oftentimes we do assume that people understand what we mean even when we don't explicitly say it, right? You can assume that somebody is understanding the entire thing of what you're saying, but that may not entirely be true. The reality is that vague and unclear communication can and will lead to unnecessary confusion, errors, and eventually frustration. And the solution to this is direct communication. And as we mentioned, that is described as the ability to clearly and concisely express your thoughts and prevent misunderstandings. However, one of the challenges a lot of people face when having to use direct communication is a fear as coming off as rude or blunt. Sometimes we have some people who are a little bit more lenient, they're a little bit softer, and they're gonna kind of tiptoe around the topics. They don't really want to address the situation at hand. Or maybe they'll use examples or roundabout ways instead of just being direct. Like instead of saying, hey, you shouldn't have done X, Y, and Z, they'll say, hey, did you know that my boss said this way of doing it is a little bit worse? Or, hey, you know what, it was brought up to me by somebody else that you shouldn't do this. They end up using loopholes or ways instead of just directly telling the employee. Now, I understand that you want to be tactful as well, right? You want to have a certain amount of professionalism and you want to be an expert and you don't want to come off as somebody who's rude, but just remember that being vague or indirect is going to be more damaging than you concerning about how tactful you can be. And eventually when you start failing to communicate directly, you're going to leave a lot of room for interpretation. And when people are left to their own devices to interpret the messages that you're telling them, they're going to fill in those blanks with whatever their assumptions are and whatever their experiences are. That means that the result you're going to get is probably not what you were imagining. And this can be anything between manager feedback, maybe a team member pressuring you to present an idea, or maybe even a friend discussing some sensitive issues. It is pretty important in all of these examples for everybody to be on the exact same page. Now, direct communication, as I mentioned, it doesn't have to be harsh, it doesn't have to be rude, it just needs to be clear, respectful, and honest. So I think here again, you want to envision yourself on the bridge. On one side of the bridge, you have somebody who's completely vague, they tiptoe around everything. On the other side, you have somebody who's extremely rude and direct and just overly, complacent about some things. So in this scenario, we're going to do the bridging mindset exercise where you need to envision yourself on the bridge. And on one side of the bridge, you have somebody who is extremely, soft, and they're just so scared to be direct. They're tiptoeing around everything. They sometimes won't even say a word, even if something's wrong. They'd rather not communicate at all. And on this side, you have somebody who's extremely rude, very blunt. They've had complaints on them for how bad they talk to an employee, and they're that type of person who you never want to go up to and speak with on any topics because they're always going to have an attitude. So in this case, you want to find yourself on the center, right? You want to work on you being somewhere in the middle of somebody who has traits that, yes, they can be very direct. They can be maybe not rude, but they'll be somebody who reports on some issues tactfully and addresses those issues with the employee at hand. But they also have that side where they're not going to overdo it. They're not going to necessarily start screaming or start being too direct. That's why you want to be in the center, because you still need traits from that individual who's a little bit softer, who's more lenient, who's softer, who's not as rude, who's not as aggressive. And that balance is pretty crucial, and you may sway from a little bit to one side of the bridge or the other side of the bridge, just depending on the scenario. But the goal is to have traits from both ends and use them to your best of the ability. One of the best ways to help with direct communication is to actually know what you're saying. And that sounds crazy, but there's times where somebody is talking and they're just saying and then they'll go and they're presenting or whatever, they're talking to you about an issue, and then they forget and they don't have anything planned, and you're just sitting there like, dude, I already forgot what you said 5 minutes ago because you're so unprepared, and now I'm losing interest. You want to make sure that before you present something or that you write or that you speak, that you have time to actually clarify those thoughts with yourself, and that you practice if it's something that's that important. Now, what is the message that you need to convey here? What are you trying to inform the team, the audience, the employees, whatever? What do you want to be the outcome of the conversation? Once you have that in mind, then it's going to be a lot easier to communicate effectively. An example here would be that you're giving feedback to an employee of yours. You don't want to dance around the topic and say you might want to consider doing things a little different next time. Well, no, what things do they have to do differently? Instead, you want to say, hey, let's approach this by doing X, Y, and Z to improve the outcome. Because what did you just do? You just outlined exactly what they were doing wrong and what they need to do better the next time. And there's obviously going to be scenarios where you don't have time to plan. There's going to be times where something crazy happens, especially in certain industries that are very fast paced, and you don't have that luxury to actually prepare or to think about what you're going to say. You're going to have to act on the moment. And here, this is where practice comes into play, and not so much maybe the theory is where you need to practice these types of things over and over again so that when those situations happen, you already have the expertise, you have the initiative, and you have the knowledge to make the right decisions at a faster pace. Here, it's going to come up to a lot of just experience, honestly. And another tip for direct communication is to just stick to the point. This doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to cut corners when you're explaining things. It just means you want to avoid the unnecessary fluff, all that extra stuff that you're adding onto the topic that is just going to make people really waste their time while you're explaining all these fancy, examples. You don't want to over explain things, and you also don't want to add filler language to soften the message, because oftentimes this is going to dilute the message themselves. And especially if you're in a work setting, people are on a clock. That time on Teams is ticking. You don't want to be holding up people longer than they have to. But for an example here, let's try an email instead, because it's a little bit different. If somebody is requesting information and you say, hey, can you send me the quarterly report by the end of Thursday? Sounds pretty good, right? Quarterly report, end of Thursday. Boom. Now imagine if somebody sends you an email and it says, hey, if it's possible, I'd really appreciate it if you could maybe send over the quarterly report at your earliest convenience. Could you imagine opening an email and then reading all that and you're just like, dude, what? Just tell me that you need the quarterly report. Hey, can you send me the quarterly report by the end of Thursday? Yeah, I can. Cool. That's an example, and it's kind of funny, but it could be a lot worse. And you have to also think that depending on the type of work that you have, it can be kind of tiresome to have to read a lot of emails. I get an insane amount of emails, and the last thing I want to do is get into these emails where people are over explaining things. Just tell me what I need to do or what you need from me so that I can work on it, and not an email like that, right? And that's just an example of a little small thing. But there's people who will send you, if people are here are, if you have a job, a corporate job, you know what I'm talking about right now. You know those people that send that list, that paragraph, and you're just like, Jesus Christ, I'm never going to finish reading this. Now, direct communication is important, but you also need to listen. And this is because when somebody is speaking, you want to give them your full attention. You want to resist the urge to formulate a response before they're even done talking. And instead of that, you want to wait till they're done talking, and you want to listen with the intention, and this is the key point here, with the intention of understanding their view. That's very important, because oftentimes maybe we can get offended, or maybe we can take it personal if somebody has a different opinion or something. But if you let them talk and you let them continue, that is better Because at the end of the day, you're going to understand their perspective and you're going to understand their view, and you can help them better when that is the case, as opposed to where it's just two people sharing their differences or something. You want to make sure that you actually understand their point, because then you can counter their point. And that's probably honestly the most important thing. If you really just have disagreed values, if you understand their point and you can actually counter it, or you can guide them to success, or you can guide them to the other opinion, that's a little bit better than you just ignoring completely where they're coming from. This is called active listening. So active listening does allow you to ask clarifying questions, which would help you understand them even better, and it leads to a more productive conversation and fewer misunderstandings. Now, another tip for direct communication here is you want to provide context when necessary. Yes, being precise is important and you don't want to add fluff, but sometimes you need context to express to the employees how critical the situation is. So when you're giving a request or you're giving instructions, just giving them a little bit of context is going to go a long way so they know why they're doing things. For example, maybe you have a project that needs to be completed at a certain deadline, explaining that it's because it's a client presentation and that it's scheduled and the day adds significance to your request because it's going to make them happier and you can retain the customer, you can get a new customer. Then the team is going to understand why you're asking for it so fast or at a specific date. And this can also be looked at when you're delivering feedback to an employee. If you're going to tell them that they're not performing up to speed, explain to them why that is impactful to the operation and to the team could be a lot better. Maybe an example here would be that when the report was late, it delayed the entire team's progress. And that's a lot more effective, in my opinion, than saying, hey, that report was late. Because it's the same thing, right? The report was late in both instances, but in one you're saying, hey, it was late and it affected the entire team and it affected this and that, so they can see the importance. And lastly, and most importantly, is you want to be open to feedback. Direct communication here is a two-way street. It's just a way to be clear and straightforward, but it's also a way to invite other people to come and communicate with you so that you can learn from them. I would definitely push for you to try to hear perspectives that are different than yours. That way you can learn different types of things. And it also creates a culture of transparency within yourself, and you're going to be more open-minded. And the more you learn, the more intellectual you are. So the art of direct communication isn't just about stripping away politeness or empathy. It's about fostering clear and honest and efficient exchanges that leave no room for misinterpretation. You want to be clear with your intentions, you want to stick to the point, and you want to listen actively while providing context. And you also want to encourage open dialogue. Direct communication has some positive outcomes. It can build trust, it saves time, and it leads to better decision making. So the next time that you're thinking about beating around the bush, remember, clarity is kindness, and direct communication is the foundation of effective, successful interactions. So ditch the ambiguity and embrace the power of being clear, concise, and direct. By doing this, you're going to help the operation. You're going to help your team members grow themselves. They're going to see you. They're going to try to follow you and follow your example, and that's going to lead to a better overall community. And that's it for today's video. Thank you guys for watching.